The earliest reference we have to a church in Saline was that it was built in the 13th century and it sat on top of a small hill. And that if you were to remove the cemetery wall, the gravestones, and what would have been a secondary church which sat in the middle of the cemetery as we look at it, you can indeed see by the gradient of the landscape that it is a small hill. Now Douglas Spears, the local historian, reckons that the church would have sat on top of the hill or just beyond in the ground of Kirklands, and that John Crane in his book of Cabbage and Kings suggests that there might have been a wooden structure up there as early as the first millennium. So let's go and have a closer look. These walls were built in about 1640, I think, approximately the same time as the secondary church, and that the reason why they're in good condition is that I think they've been maintained along with that church until about 1810, at which point we moved across the road to what we now think of as Saline Parish Church. So if we take a little wander up here, again you can see the height of the wall, and just come through here, compared to the field, and again just the height difference is built up over the centuries. There we go. I think the steps are more likely to be an 18th century date, and that they look newer compared to the surrounding walls at either side, and I think these have been added later. So if we wander up, we'll have a look at the secondary church first. So if you look in front of us very carefully, you can see the indentation in the ground, which is where we believe the old church tower was from the 17th century. And if we just wander around here and look immediately up the way, if you look at just beyond the first 3 or 4 tombstones here, you can see an embankment at the back, and I think that was the boundary wall of the secondary church. It's interesting to note that on either side of the church is many tombstones, and that for somehow these stones in the middle came A, later, as a later date after the church was demolished, and B, is that there's only a few of them. So theoretically I'm going to walk through the old church, and we're going to wander off just to see how the landscape has changed. One of the reasons for all the little bumps and hillocks in the village is that the subsidence of the grave tombs themselves and gravestones. But there's an interesting one over here, in that I always used to think it was a gravestone marker, and yet Jean Coker, doing some research, dug just a little below the surface and found that it was to be a full-length gravestone. And that's if you were to dig down, you'd have come to another level of the graveyard. Now, it's known that at one point they were known to have just, if the graveyard got too full, they'd just dig it out and put the bones, bury them within the graveyard still, and then restart some again. But I think that the earth that was dug out from the old church was used to strengthen up the walls, give it that height differential between the ground and the field adjacent, and that indeed stones like this were covered up at one point. So if we wander up further, so this is the site, I think, where roughly the medieval church was. As Douglas Spears suggests, it might be just beyond the wall in the grounds of Kirklands. But if you use your imagination and strip back the centuries, indeed millennium, you might indeed be looking out from what would have been the view from Saline's first medieval church from the 13th century. Thank you very much for listening, folks, and I will hopefully see you soon. Okay, thanks again, guys. Bye-bye.